Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story. The air in the courtroom felt suffocating, thick with judgment and the low murmur of whispers from the gallery. It was almost as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, squeezing out any air that might make the situation easier to breathe through. I sat at the defense table, my hands clenched together in front of me, trying to steady myself as I faced the storm brewing in front of me. I had been here before, covering war zones where chaos and violence were my constant companions. But this was different. This was a fight for my dignity, for my name, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. Victoria, my younger sister, stood across from me, her voice ringing out in the quiet courtroom like a weapon. Her words were sharp, her tone venomous, aimed straight at my heart. "You've always been a manipulator, Helena," she spat, her eyes narrowing as she cast a contemptuous glance in my direction. "How could you exploit Dad when he was already on his deathbed? How could you manipulate him like that?" I felt the heat rise to my face, the shame she so casually handed out to me, landing on my shoulders with the weight of 1,000 stones. My breath hitched, but I didn't respond. She was twisting the truth, painting me as the villain in a story that wasn't mine to control. Behind her, my mother, Margaret, sat with a solemn expression, her face drawn tight. She refused to look at me directly, but her words, when they came, were as cold and cutting as the courtroom's marble floors. "Helena doesn't deserve that award," she said, her voice shaking slightly with fury, but also, I noticed, with the unmistakable undercurrent of bitterness. "She doesn't deserve anything, not our father's estate, and certainly not that thing she's wearing." She pointed at the prestigious International Journalism Award hanging around my neck, the one I'd earned years ago, when I was still a photojournalist risking my life for a story. The one that had taken me to places no one else would dare go, from the ruins of Aleppo to the forests of South Sudan. The one that had meant something once, and until today, when it was nothing more than a symbol of how much my mother had come to despise me. I felt the eyes of the room on me, like 100 microscopes, each one prying into every inch of my soul. I could hear the reporters in the back scribbling, the whisper of murmurs rising up around me. My family was laying their accusations down one after another, and everyone seemed to believe them. Everyone except me. Without saying a word, I reached up and unclipped the gold medal from around my neck. My hands felt stiff, the act so simple, but it felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. Slowly, I placed it on the table in front of me. The sound of it landing was soft, almost insignificant in the storm of words that had just passed between my family and me. But in that moment, it felt like the loudest noise in the world, a gesture of defiance, a quiet surrender to the battle I was about to lose, but a refusal to let anyone take the one thing I had earned. It wasn't just an award, it was everything I had fought for. I didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. But as I sat there, waiting for the next wave of accusations, I steeled myself for what was coming. I had nothing left to lose. It was a strange feeling, stepping into my father's house again after so many years. The silence was overwhelming, oppressive in a way that reminded me of the trenches I had covered, where you learned to stay silent, to wait, to hope for something, anything, that would give you a sense of direction. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign land, and there were no soldiers to protect me. This was my family's home, and everything about it had changed. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded too loud, its deep chimes echoing through the empty rooms. When I first arrived, I barely recognized the house. It wasn't that it had changed so much physically, it was the atmosphere, the weight of neglect hanging in the air like dust. My mother had been too consumed by her own worries to care for him, and Victoria, always caught up in her work and her life, had hardly visited. I could see it the moment I stepped inside. The half-empty house, the dimness that clung to the walls, the smell of old furniture and stale air. My father, once so strong, now sat slumped in his favorite armchair, his frailty undeniable. His once vibrant eyes were dull, distant, a mere shadow of the man he had been. He barely recognized me at first. I remember the first time he looked at me after I walked into the room. It was a fleeting, confused glance, the recognition slow to return. But then it came. That spark, that flicker of warmth in his tired eyes. "Helena?" he asked, his voice rasping, barely above a whisper. It was as if the years of estrangement, the cold silences between us, had disappeared for just that moment. I sat beside him, my hands shaking as I took his in mine. "I'm here, Dad," I said softly. "I'm here. We'll get through this together." In the beginning, it felt like I was running on autopilot. The feeding, the cleaning, the endless hours sitting beside him as he rested. I didn't mind. I couldn't. Not after everything. I was so used to the chaos of war zones, to the adrenaline of near-death situations. But this was different. There was no enemy to face, no immediate threat, just the slow march of time, stealing pieces of my father away with each passing day. And in the silence of those weeks, I found something unexpected, a chance to talk. Not just about the past, but about everything. His regrets, his hopes, the things he never said, the things I never had the courage to ask him before. I spent hours reading to him, even when he couldn't fully understand me. The soft cadence of my voice seemed to bring him comfort, and I would sit there, day after day, reading books I knew he used to love. Stories of war, adventure, history, books that had been tucked away for years, forgotten in dusty corners. There were small moments, fragile and fleeting. When I saw him smile, when he called me by my name and not some distant memory of the daughter who had walked away from him all those years ago. He even whispered something one day, so quietly I wasn't sure I had heard it right. "I'm proud of you, Helena." The words hung in the air, suspended between us. I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was hold his hand tighter, the years of silence between us suddenly feeling like a distant memory, a ghost that could never haunt us again. But even as we shared those moments, there were others who talked. The neighbors, the friends who came to visit, the whispers, like knives, that tried to tear at the fabric of the family I was trying so hard to salvage. They called me selfish, manipulative. They said I was after the estate, that I was waiting for him to die. I never said anything. It was easier that way. The silence was my shield. I focused on what mattered. The truth was, I was here for him, no one else. And when it finally came time to say goodbye, when the hospital visits became more frequent and I saw the life drain from his body in slow, steady waves, I stayed. I stayed, and I watched. And I held his hand through every labored breath. I didn't need to hear the accusations. I didn't need to respond. All I needed was to be there for him. In his final days, I didn't know how to mourn him yet. It felt too soon. The anger, the hurt, the questions, they were still tangled up inside me, and I wasn't ready to let them go. Not yet. But one thing was clear. My father was leaving, and I was the only one who had truly seen him, the only one who had truly cared for him in his final days, and that would be my truth, no matter what anyone else said. It's strange, isn't it? How silence can shape you? Silence in the war zones was survival. The quiet that fell between explosions, the hushed whispers of soldiers and civilians alike, moving through rubble as if any sound might mean death. But back home, the silence was something different. It was punishment, the kind that settles in your bones and leaves you wondering what you've done wrong, even when you're sure you haven't. I grew up in a house where silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an accusation. Every dinner was a battle for attention, a contest of who could speak the loudest without actually saying anything. My father, who had been a commanding presence once, became an enigma to me as I grew older. He held the weight of years of unsaid things, of disappointment and bitterness, but he never spoke of it. He never told me why he couldn't accept the decisions I made, the path I chose. I remember the night I told him I was leaving law school to become a photojournalist. The look in his eyes as he slammed his fist on the table, the rage building up like a storm. He called me a disgrace. He said I was throwing my future away for a life of uncertainty, for a career that had no real value. He didn't understand. I didn't want a future I could predict. I wanted the kind of life that mattered, the kind of life where I could capture the truth of the world, even if it meant risking my own. I can still feel the sting of his slap, a memory that never really left me, a reminder that my choice, my life, had somehow torn apart the little bit of pride he had left in me. "You think you're better than everyone else?" he had yelled. "You think your pictures matter more than your family? You think running around with a camera will make you someone?" I had stood there, feeling the weight of those words press down on me. It was the moment I realized that my father would never understand me, would never be proud of the path I'd chosen. He wasn't capable of seeing beyond the walls he had built, the walls that had kept him from truly seeing me. I left that night, and the silence that followed became a permanent fixture in my relationship with him. We never spoke again like we had before. There were no more shared laughs, no more advice given, no more understanding between us. Just that silence, hanging between us like a shadow. And then, years later, I went to war. I thought it would help. I thought it would silence the hurt, the shame of feeling like an outsider in my own family. I told myself that the danger, the chaos, would give me something real to focus on, a purpose, a reason for being. I threw myself into the front line, capturing moments of raw emotion and survival, taking photographs of soldiers and civilians alike, their lives suspended in a single frame. But war changes you in ways you can't predict. I remember one mission in Aleppo, a chaotic ambush that seemed like the end of me. Bullets were flying, and everything around me blurred into the kind of nightmare that I had once only seen in film. There was no time to think, no time to process. Just instinct. I pulled two wounded journalists into cover, one of them barely breathing, the other crying out for help. I remember the exhaustion in their eyes, the way their hands shook as I tried to save them, and the overwhelming feeling of relief when the rescue team arrived. I didn't get the chance to ask them if they remembered my name. None of that mattered. What mattered was that I had done something that mattered. I had saved lives. I had made a difference. But even then, there was no recognition, no congratulations, just silence. The silence of the people I had saved, who would go back to their own lives, and the silence of my family, who had never understood why I did what I did. They'd never seen the truth behind it, the reason I chose this path. They couldn't see the quiet strength that had shaped me, the survival I had learned from years of being unheard. And now, sitting in that courtroom, facing my mother and sister, the same silence clung to me like a thick fog. I wasn't the daughter they wanted me to be. I wasn't the perfect, obedient woman who stayed home and followed the rules. I was the one who left, the one who abandoned the family's expectations to pursue something bigger, something that had cost me everything. But maybe, in a way, it had also given me something they would never understand. It gave me strength. It gave me resilience. It gave me the ability to survive, to stand up for myself even when the world turned its back. As I sat there, my mother's eyes accusing me, my sister's voice cutting into my defenses, I realized something. The silence I had learned to live with wasn't my punishment. It was my survival. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped surviving for them. The courtroom buzzed with an eerie kind of tension. The air, already thick with the weight of the accusations, felt even heavier as Victoria stepped forward with the video. She moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the room, looking for the perfect moment to strike. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, reporters scribbling, my mother staring with that tight-lipped expression she always wore when she was trying to control the situation. Victoria stood there, looking as polished as ever, like she had nothing to lose. Her hand shook slightly as she held up the remote to play the video. "This," she said, her voice crisp, "is what Helena Cross doesn't want you to see." The video flickered to life on the big screen behind us. It was a recording from the night before our father died. I recognized the setting immediately, the sterile hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows over the walls. The camera zoomed in on me sitting beside my father's bed, the lines of exhaustion written across my face as I held his hand. I was trying to comfort him, trying to make him feel less alone in the final hours of his life. But then the camera shifted. A voice, not mine, cut through the stillness. "You look like you're only here for the money," Victoria's voice echoed through the speakers, "just like I always thought." The room went silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a cloud of smoke. I could feel my pulse quicken, my stomach twisting as the video continued. It wasn't a long clip, but it didn't need to be. The footage was carefully edited, just enough to cast me in a light I couldn't escape from. The image shifted, and I saw myself again. This time, standing over my father's bed, looking tired and, yes, maybe a little cold, but the context was everything. The moments leading up to this, the nights I had spent by his side, the hours I'd spent alone with him, making sure he had everything he needed, were nowhere to be found in the video. Only the version of me that my sister wanted everyone to see. The version that fit her narrative. The version that made me look cruel. The video cut to a moment where I seemed to turn away from my father, my face showing frustration. Frustration with the endless paperwork, the bills piling up, the responsibility that I had been carrying alone for months. I had been tired. I had been human. But the video twisted it all into something ugly. "Look at her." My mother's voice rose from the corner. "She's angry, She doesn't care about your father. She never did. The video ended with a long, uncomfortable silence. The room was still. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me. The whispers, the judgment. Victoria smiled, her eyes sparkling with that victorious gleam. You don't have to take my word for it. You've all seen the truth. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The humiliation, the way my mother nodded along in approval, the way everyone in the room, even the judge, looked at me as if I were nothing more than the villain in some tragic story. I didn't speak immediately. Part of me wanted to lash out, to defend myself, to shout that the video wasn't the truth, that it was all manipulated to make me look like a monster. But then, as I sat there, I realized that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. So I did nothing. I didn't even flinch. I sat there, in that chair, letting their words sink in, letting their accusations hang in the air. I let the room breathe in their version of the truth, and I stayed quiet. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything you could say, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. But I knew, deep down, that when the time came, when the truth needed to be told, I would be ready to fight back. The real story had never been told, not in that video, and not in the courtroom, and I wasn't going to let them strip away my dignity without giving them the truth in return. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between me and Victoria. The murmurs in the room grew louder, the uncertainty palpable. But I didn't respond. Not yet. I was waiting for the right moment, and I knew it was coming. The truth always finds its way to the surface. The courtroom felt even quieter after the video ended, as though the room itself was holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't allow myself to react, to show any weakness. I refused to let their accusations, their carefully crafted lies, shake me. The judge looked up from his notes, his eyes darting between me and Victoria, his expression unreadable. This court will take a brief recess. We'll reconvene shortly. I stood, my legs stiff, my hands still clutched tightly together. The whispers of the gallery surrounded me, but I blocked them out. I wasn't interested in what they thought. I wasn't even sure I could hear them over the ringing in my ears. I took a step toward the back of the room, trying to breathe, trying to steady myself. But before I could reach the door, something stopped me. The air shifted. I turned, unsure of what had caught my attention. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway. His presence was unmistakable. It wasn't just his height or his bearing, it was the look on his face, the intense, almost haunted expression in his eyes. Samuel Drake. I hadn't seen him in years, not since that harrowing day in Aleppo, when everything seemed to go to hell, when a sudden, brutal ambush caught us off guard, the kind of chaos that strips you of your humanity, leaving you only with survival instincts and the will to keep going. Samuel had been one of the journalists with me that day. He was the one I'd pulled out of that burning building, his leg shattered, blood staining his clothes. We'd barely escaped with our lives, but we had made it. I hadn't thought about Samuel in years, but there he was, standing in the courtroom, looking as if he had walked straight out of my memories. He made his way toward the bench, his gaze locked on the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I'd like to speak on behalf of the defendant." I felt the eyes of the courtroom shift toward him. Their curiosity piqued. Even Victoria's smug expression faltered, replaced with confusion. "Mr. Drake," the judge said, surprised but not unwelcoming. "What do you have to offer to this case?" "I'm a retired war correspondent," Samuel said, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "And I've known Helena Cross for many years. She's not the woman your witnesses are describing." The room fell into a stunned silence. The judge gestured for him to approach, and Samuel took a step forward, his posture firm and unyielding. Victoria shot me a venomous glance, her lips curling into a snarl, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't look at her. I was too focused on the man standing before me, the one whose words could change everything. Samuel cleared his throat, and then, without hesitation, began his testimony. "I've been a journalist for over 30 years, he said, his voice steady and calm. "And in all that time, I've seen a lot of people who will lie, manipulate, and take advantage of others to get ahead. But Helena Cross isn't one of them. She's the opposite. I've seen her risk her life for a story, for people she didn't even know. I've seen her pull 2 colleagues out of the line of fire in Aleppo, saving their lives at great personal risk." A murmur rippled through the room. Victoria's face turned pale. She was trying to gather herself, but her composure had cracked. She hadn't expected this. None of us had. "I owe my life to Helena," Samuel continued, his voice unwavering. "And so do many others. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for money or fame. She did it because that's who she is. That's the truth." The room was still as Samuel's words settled over everyone. The image of me, the image that Victoria had tried so hard to paint, was beginning to unravel. Samuel wasn't done. He reached into his bag and pulled out an envelope. "Helena never knew this, but your father," he said, looking directly at me, "nominated her for a humanitarian award years ago. He admired her, even when she didn't know it. I was the one who helped him write that letter." I felt the weight of his words hit me like a wave. My chest tightened, and I could feel the tears threatening to spill, but I refused to let them fall. I had to remain strong. I had to keep my composure. Samuel passed the envelope to the judge, who looked through its contents. The judge's expression softened, and he nodded in acknowledgement. "This will be added to the record," he said quietly. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth open in disbelief. My mother's face was a mask of shock. No one had expected this. They had thought they could control the narrative, twist the facts, and make me the villain. But now, the truth was slowly making its way to the surface. Samuel turned to face me, his gaze steady. "Helena," he said softly, "you may not know it, but your father saw you. He was proud of you." The weight of those words hit me harder than I expected. It was the validation I had longed for, the recognition I never thought I would get. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally being told. I didn't know how the trial would end. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing for certain. Samuel had just changed the course of everything. And for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. The courtroom was still reverberating with the aftershock of Samuel's testimony. The atmosphere had shifted, like the tide turning. But the fight wasn't over. Victoria's face was flushed with anger, but it wasn't the controlled fury of before. No, this time it was something more like fear. Fear that the foundation of her accusations was crumbling right before her eyes. I sat back in my seat, my heart still racing from the unexpected turn of events. But I knew this was just the beginning. There was still more to come. I didn't know what exactly, but I could feel it, like the first rumbles of a storm that hadn't yet reached its peak. As the judge prepared to call the next witness, I noticed a figure in the back of the room. She was standing near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, looking uncertain but resolute. A woman in her late 40s, her face worn with time but not without kindness. Nurse Abigail Rivers. I didn't recognize her at first. It had been months since I had seen her, but she had been the one to take care of my father during his final days. I hadn't thought about her much, not in the way I had focused on my family's betrayal. But there she was, standing at the edge of the room, hesitant, yet determined. The judge caught sight of her and nodded. "Please, step forward," he called. Nurse Rivers walked slowly down the aisle toward the witness stand, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She paused before the judge's bench, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. I felt a strange sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, not because I doubted her honesty, but because I had no idea what she was about to say. She had been there during some of the most intimate moments of my father's decline, moments I couldn't have possibly seen, and if she was testifying now, it meant she had something to say that could change everything. The prosecutor nodded at Nurse Rivers and began with a simple question. "Please, Ms. Rivers, tell us about your time caring for Mr. Cross." Nurse Rivers hesitated, her eyes flicking toward me before she began speaking. I was hired to care for Mr. Cross during his final months. He had suffered a heart attack, and he needed constant attention, care, someone to be there for him. His daughter, Helena, she was there, every day. She never left him. She helped him with everything, from meals to medication, from bathing to reading to him when he couldn't stay awake long enough to read for himself. Her voice was quiet but steady, and I could see Victoria shifting in her seat, her discomfort palpable. This wasn't the version of events that had been painted for the court. I wasn't sure what she was going to say next, but my instincts were right. Nurse Rivers wasn't done. "But," she continued, her eyes lowering, "there's something else, something that needs to be said." The room seemed to hold its breath. Every single person in that courtroom, aware that she was about to reveal something crucial. Victoria's expression flickered with panic, and I could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind. Whatever Abigail was about to say, It wasn't good. Nurse Rivers paused for a moment, gathering her courage. Before Mr. Cross passed, I was approached by Victoria Cross, she said, her voice low but firm. She asked me to delete a recording of her father's final wishes. She offered me money to erase it. A gasp rose from the gallery. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. I refused, Nurse Rivers continued, her face set with quiet resolve. I knew it was wrong. Mr. Cross deserved to have his final words heard, especially in a situation like this. I never went through with it, but I knew what was going on, and I knew it wasn't right. I couldn't be part of that. The room went completely silent. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her face pale with shock. Victoria's face twisted in horror. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but no words came out. Nurse Rivers wasn't finished. I kept a copy of the recording, she said, her voice growing stronger, and I have it here today. It's Mr. Cross's final message, his last wish. He wanted Helena to inherit the house. He wanted her to have everything for her care and sacrifices. Her words struck me like a lightning bolt, my father's final wishes. They weren't what Victoria had claimed. They weren't what she had tried to make everyone believe. The room erupted in whispers. Even the judge leaned forward. His curiosity piqued as he looked between me and Nurse Rivers. She handed the recording to the judge, and he examined it briefly before nodding at the court clerk to make a copy for the record. I'm sorry, Helena, Nurse Rivers added softly, her eyes apologetic. I didn't know how to say this before, but I couldn't let this go on any longer. Your father, he trusted you, and I don't think anyone should get away with twisting that. I didn't know what to say. I was stunned. My emotions were a whirlwind. For months, I had been portrayed as a villain. I had been painted as someone who had manipulated my father, someone who had taken advantage of his weakness. And now, the truth was finally out. I looked over at Victoria. Her face had drained of color, her eyes wild with panic. She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. I think this clears things up, the judge said, his voice calm but firm. We'll take a brief recess while we verify this recording and discuss what we've just heard. Victoria's shoulders slumped as she sat back down, defeated. The room buzzed with a new energy, the truth hanging in the air like a heavy weight. My mother, who had been so quick to judge me, now looked like she was struggling to process everything that had just unfolded. But I wasn't interested in their reactions anymore. This was my moment. The truth was out, and now I would stand tall, no matter what came next. The judge called for a short break, and as I stood, I caught Samuel Drake's eye across the room. He gave me a small, reassuring nod. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The courthouse steps were crowded, a swarm of reporters and onlookers pressing in from all sides. Their cameras flashed like a barrage of firecrackers, capturing every step I took, every glance I shot toward the street. I tried to ignore the buzz, the incessant noise as I made my way down the stairs with a steady pace. Behind me, the courtroom doors were still open, and the murmurs from the building seeped out into the air like the final whispers of a storm passing through. My legs were heavy, my body tired, but I kept walking. I had come too far to let the circus of the media distract me. The weight of the trial was still heavy on my shoulders, but there was a certain weightlessness too. The truth was out. My father's last wishes had been spoken, and with them, my name had been cleared. For the first time, it felt like I wasn't being suffocated by my family's lies. But that didn't mean it was over, not by a long shot. Helena Cross! Helena, how does it feel to have the truth on your side? The barrage of questions hit me like a tidal wave as I stepped onto the sidewalk. A reporter, microphone shoved into my face, his camera trained on me like a predator ready to pounce. The air was thick with curiosity, with judgment, and it felt like I was drowning in it. I didn't answer. Instead, I kept walking, my gaze fixed straight ahead, my movements deliberate. I could hear their footsteps quicken behind me as they chased after, demanding answers. Do you think your family will apologize? Another shouted. How much of the estate are you set to inherit? A third asked, her voice sharp with a mixture of intrigue and disbelief. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Just as I reached the corner of the courthouse, a group of veterans who had stood by me during my photojournalism career appeared from the crowd. Their faces were set with a quiet respect. It wasn't a loud declaration, not the kind of attention that reporters craved, but it meant more than anything else in that moment. One of them, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard, stepped forward, saluting me silently. Then, one by one, The rest followed suit, their hands snapping to their brows in a gesture that was simple but profound. I didn't know what to do. The crowd around us had grown, their murmurs now mixing with whispers of awe. It felt like the world had tilted slightly on its axis, and for the first time, I wasn't the object of scorn. I wasn't the villain. I was the woman who had fought, and somehow, for the first time, the world recognized it. I nodded to them, my throat tight. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I don't deserve your attention, but I'll take it." "Yes, you do," the man with the beard replied, his voice gravelly, worn by years of battle. "You've earned more than we can ever give back." The reporters stood frozen, unsure of how to react to the unexpected show of solidarity. Cameras clicked frantically, capturing the moment, but there was no sensationalism in the air anymore. The veterans had turned what could have been a media spectacle into something meaningful. "Helena, are you planning to speak to the media?" a reporter shouted, clearly desperate for something to fill the silence. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I turned and started walking again, my steps purposeful, steady. I heard a few scattered calls behind me, more questions I chose not to engage with. The veterans fell in line behind me, forming a quiet, steady support as I walked away from the chaos, toward the calm that was waiting for me at the end of the street. I didn't want to speak to the media. I didn't want to feed the flames of a spectacle that had already burned too hot for too long. Instead, I just needed to breathe. I needed to live quietly, without the constant judgment and scrutiny of a family that had never truly seen me. And as I walked, the quiet support of those veterans beside me, the ones who had seen me at my best and worst, in war zones where we fought for survival, not recognition, reminded me of something important. They understood me. They knew my worth, even when no one else did. I was done fighting the world's expectations, done fighting for validation. I didn't need the media. I didn't need my family. I had already given them everything. The only thing left was for me to take a step into my own future, to rebuild a life that was mine and mine alone. I had been quiet long enough, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence me again. The following days were a blur of headlines, viral videos, and media inquiries. But I didn't engage. I didn't look back. Instead, I focused on what mattered: healing, rebuilding, and reclaiming my own sense of peace. Victoria's face was everywhere. Her attempt to control the narrative splashed across tabloids. Some praised her for her composure in court, while others called her out for her betrayal. The public opinion was divided, but I didn't care. It wasn't about the world's judgment anymore. It was about mine. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to seek anyone's approval. I had already made my choice: to walk away from the toxic cycles of my family, to stop defending myself against accusations that weren't mine to bear. And as I sat quietly in my apartment one evening, scrolling through the endless updates, I realized something. The world could twist and turn, could praise or condemn, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was how I saw myself, and for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to see myself clearly. The final blow came quietly, a whisper in the growing noise. My family tried again, of course, to repair the rift, but their calls went unanswered. Victoria's messages turned into desperate pleas, and my mother's guilt-tripped texts grew more frequent. But each time, I deleted them without hesitation. I wasn't their punching bag anymore. I wasn't the backup they could lean on when things got rough. I was done. And as the autumn leaves swirled outside my window, the weight of the past finally began to lift. The battle was over, and in its wake, I found a quiet peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. The truth had been told. Now it was time for me to live. The house had always felt bigger when I was a child, larger, more imposing, like it could swallow you whole. But now, standing in front of it after all this time, it felt smaller, less intimidating, almost sad, like it had long ago given up on the idea of being a home. The trees in the yard were still the same, their branches twisting in the wind, casting long shadows across the cracked driveway. The hedges, once meticulously trimmed, had begun to grow wild, unruly, much like the relationships inside the walls that had once held our family together. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my weight. It was strange, this feeling of being home, but not being home at all. For years, this place had been my battleground, the scene of too many quiet wars, too many battles fought in silence. But now, as I stood there, I realized something. The house wasn't the problem. It had never been the problem. The problem had always been inside. the expectations, the demands, the weight of a family that had never truly seen me. I pushed the door open, the familiar creak of hinges echoing through the empty space. The living room stretched out before me, the furniture still the same, the walls still painted in that faded shade of beige my mother had insisted on years ago. But it all felt different now. Stale, maybe, as if no one had lived here in years. The air was thick with the ghosts of memories that had been ignored and left to gather dust. The house wasn't mine yet, not entirely. I hadn't made any changes, hadn't touched anything. But as I stepped inside, I felt a strange sense of ownership over the space, not because it was a physical possession, but because it was the one thing that had always tied me to my family. And now, it was the one thing I could take back. I walked through the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last, until I reached the stairs leading to the second floor. I paused at the top of the stairs and glanced down the long hallway, where my father's study had once been. It was empty now, the door ajar, the room untouched. A room full of books, papers, things that had never meant much to me before, but now felt like remnants of a life I had never fully understood. I walked into the study and stood for a moment, taking it all in. The desk, still scattered with old papers. The bookshelves lined with books, some well-loved, others barely touched, and then, there it was, sitting on the corner of the desk, a drawer slightly open, like it was waiting for me. I walked over and gently pulled it open. Inside, there were a few things: old photographs, a few letters, some bills that had never been paid. But what caught my eye was the small envelope tucked at the back. I opened it carefully, unsure of what I would find inside. A letter, my father's handwriting. "Helena," it began, "I don't know how much longer I'll be here. You and I haven't always seen eye to eye, and I know I haven't been the father you wanted. But I need you to know something. Something that I never told you." I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I read his words. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't know if I ever would be. But the letter went on. "I'm proud of you, Helena, even when I didn't show it, even when I couldn't say it. I've watched you from a distance, and I've seen the way you've lived your life, the way you've fought for what you believe in. I never said it, but I admired that. I always have." I stopped reading for a moment, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. The letter wasn't much, a few short lines, but they were enough. They were everything. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something. It was a sign that my father had seen me, even if he hadn't been able to say it in person. The house, for all its faults, had given me this. A piece of closure, a moment of understanding that I had never expected. I stood there in silence for a long while, letting the truth sink in. This wasn't the end, I knew that. There was still work to be done, still healing to be had. But for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. I left the study, and as I made my way back down the stairs, I noticed the dust in the corners, the small cracks in the walls. There was a lot of work to do, but it wasn't just the house that needed fixing, it was me. And as I stepped outside, the weight of the world still heavy on my shoulders, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. I wasn't just reclaiming this house, I was reclaiming myself. I didn't have to keep fighting for approval. I didn't have to keep living for the people who had never truly seen me. I could live for me, and that was enough. As the sun began to set, I took one last look at the house. It was still standing, still stubborn, still full of memories. Some painful, some precious. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, it could become a home again. Not for my family, but for me. And that was all I needed. Months passed, and the noise of the trial faded into the background. The headlines had moved on to their next scandal, and the world had shifted its focus elsewhere. But for me, the quiet aftermath was its own kind of reckoning. I attended the memorial event for veterans and journalists that summer. It was one of those annual gatherings where unsung heroes, the ones who'd never made it into the papers, who weren't famous enough for the spotlight, were quietly acknowledged. There would be speeches, stories shared, and small tributes to those who had given their lives for causes that often went unnoticed. The ceremony was held at a small hall on the outskirts of the city. I had no intention of making a scene, no desire to be the center of attention. I wasn't looking for accolades. I had never needed them. But when I walked into that hall, I felt the familiar weight of being an outsider. I sat at the back, as I always did at events like this, keeping to the shadows. The air smelled of old wood and polished brass, a slight musk that lingered in the corners of the room. There was a stage at the front, framed with photographs of people I didn't recognize, faces I had once shared stories with, people I had crossed paths with on assignments. I wasn't sure why I was here. Maybe to honor them, the ones who had lived their lives in the shadows, or maybe just because it had become routine, something I did every year. The stories they told, the ones that made me laugh and cry in equal measure, made me feel like I wasn't as alone as I sometimes thought. The speeches began, one by one. Each veteran, each journalist who took the stage spoke about their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs. Some had been in the thick of war zones, others had faced political uprisings or natural disasters. Some spoke with humor, others with a quiet reverence for the hardships they had endured. I listened, nodding along with the crowd, but in the back of my mind, something gnawed at me. It was that old feeling again, the one I had learned to live with for so many years. The feeling of being unnoticed, of not being part of the narrative. Not because I was incapable, but because I had always been quiet. I didn't need to be the star, but I also didn't want to be forgotten. And then, just as I was about to lose myself in the stories of others, the host called my name. "Helena Cross," he said, his voice echoing across the room. A journalist whose work has taken her across the globe, whose courage has brought her into situations where few others would dare to go. "Please, join us on stage." The room went silent for a moment before the applause started, slow at first, then swelling, until it filled the entire hall. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't even sure I deserved it. But the applause continued, and I found my feet moving toward the stage without fully realizing it. The host gave me a small smile as I approached the podium. "Helena," he said, shaking my hand, "we want to honor you today, not just for your work, but for your quiet strength. You've shown us that true resilience doesn't always need to be loud. It doesn't need to be public. Sometimes it's simply in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when no one else is watching." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of all that had happened. The trial, the family, the years of silence, lifting off me, just a little bit. I took the small plaque he handed me, a simple recognition for the work I had done. But it was more than that. It was the acknowledgement I had been craving, the one I hadn't asked for but had needed all along. I looked out at the crowd, the faces of people who had seen the worst of the world and still carried on, the ones who knew what it meant to survive in the shadows, to be forgotten by society, but still push forward. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't just the daughter they tried to erase. I wasn't just the photojournalist who had been abandoned by her family. I was Helena Cross, and I had made my mark on the world, quietly and without expectation. The applause died down, and I nodded my thanks to the crowd, stepping back from the podium. There were no grand speeches, no tearful confessions, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had come before and everything that still lay ahead. I walked off the stage, the plaque in my hand, and felt the weight of it settle in. I didn't need the spotlight. I didn't need the world to see me, not in the way they had tried to force me into their narrative. But here, in this small hall filled with people who understood the cost of silence, I finally felt like I belonged. And as I walked back to my seat, the quiet recognition from the veterans and journalists who had stood with me, those who had saluted me earlier, felt like a reward more precious than anything I had ever earned. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living, and that was enough. The memorial event had ended, and the hall was slowly emptying, the air now quieter, less charged with the weight of public recognition. I stood near the exit, lingering just long enough to let the last few guests filter out. The applause still echoed in my ears, though it had been long replaced by the sound of muted conversations and footsteps. I wasn't sure what had changed inside me, but something had. The award, the quiet recognition that had eluded me for so long, felt different now. Not because of the acknowledgement itself, but because for the first time, I wasn't seeking anyone's approval. I wasn't craving validation. As I walked out into the cool evening air, the fading light of the day casting long shadows on the ground, I found myself smiling. It wasn't the smile of someone basking in the spotlight. It was the smile of someone who had learned that they didn't need to be seen by everyone to feel whole. I was walking away from the noise, from the people who had used me, from the family who had abandoned me when it suited them. But now I was stepping into something new, something that wasn't defined by their expectations or their grudges. I didn't know exactly what it would look like, but I knew it wouldn't involve silence, not anymore. I had my own voice now. As I reached my car, I was surprised to see someone standing by it, a young woman, late 20s perhaps, with a camera hanging around her neck. Her eyes were bright with excitement, but there was a calmness about her too. "Helena Cross?" she asked, her voice tentative but curious. I raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised. "Yes? I I just wanted to thank you. I don't know if you remember me, but I've been following your work for years. Well, I've always wanted to be a photojournalist, but I didn't think I could do it, not after everything you've gone through. But hearing your story, seeing how you've carried on, it made me believe I could do it too." Her words caught me off guard. I had been so wrapped up in my own healing that I hadn't stopped to consider the impact my journey might have had on others. And for the first time, I realized just how far my story had traveled. "You're welcome," I said softly, genuinely moved. "You can do it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She smiled, a mix of gratitude and admiration in her eyes. "Thank you. I've been struggling with the idea of whether I should keep going, but your work, it showed me that it's worth it, even when it seems impossible." I smiled back, feeling something shift inside me. "It's worth it. Just remember to keep your voice, no matter what anyone else says." With that, she nodded, and I watched her walk away, her steps light and filled with a new kind of purpose. It was the kind of thing I used to dream of, back when I was still fighting for a place in this world, when I thought I had to prove myself to everyone who doubted me. Now I understood. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to fit anyone's mold. I just needed to keep living my truth. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the car, I realized I hadn't been this content in a long time. It wasn't the kind of happiness that screamed for attention or basked in applause. It was the kind of contentment that came from knowing you had earned your peace, earned your place in the world, without anyone else's permission. I drove through the winding streets, the soft hum of the engine filling the space around me, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of the past was still there, of course, still lingering like a scar. But now it was something I could carry. It didn't define me. It wasn't a burden, it was a part of me, one I had learned to accept. I thought of the veterans who had saluted me earlier, of the recognition I had received. But more than that, I thought of how I had stood there, in the back of that hall, letting their respect wash over me without needing to explain myself. I didn't need to fight anymore. As the city lights flickered in the distance, I realized that I had finally stepped into a new chapter, one where I wasn't fighting for anyone's approval, not even my family's. I was living for me now, and that was enough. When I arrived home, I didn't feel the need to immediately check the endless notifications on my phone, the calls from reporters, or the messages from family. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked inside, and set my keys down on the counter. The house was quiet, and for the first time, it felt like my space, my sanctuary. I had spent so much of my life trying to make sense of other people's expectations, their criticisms. But now, as I stood in the place I had fought so hard to claim, I realized that none of that mattered anymore. My worth was no longer tied to their judgments or their grudges. My worth was tied to the person I had become, and for the first time, I felt like I was living my life on my own terms. The past would always be there, in pieces scattered around me. But that was okay, because I was finally living, truly living, for the first time, and I didn't need anyone's validation to know that I had done it on my own. I smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile, and I let the weight of everything I had survived fall away, just a little bit. I wasn't looking for recognition anymore. I had found something better, a sense of purpose, a sense of self, and the knowledge that my journey was mine, and mine alone, and that was enough.